I posted to Canvas a description of your last labs. We have essentially 3 weeks left. We have 2 classes this week. We have 1 class next week for Thanksgiving. We don't have class on Thursday. And then we have 2 classes the following weeks. So today I want to go over database stuff. The last day of class, I'd kind of like everyone to show what they've done on their application. You might be able to do that throughout the weeks, but specifically the last day of class it would be good because you should have made some progress to that. And then there'll be a short final that'll be online, and I promise to make it easy. All right. Your last assignments I want you to do incrementally, and your lab that's due next week, 13, is to just make a proposal for the project. Describe what you want to do. Include a mock-up of any screens. In other words, you don't have to create the screens in Android, but just in Word, create something that shows like what it will have. And define any classes that you're going to create. I want you to do include an alternative, at least one alternative resource for language. So if you want to pick, so the easy one is like do a language one and like do a French or Spanish or something. Use Google Translate to translate your terms into another language. It's not like I'm going to be bringing in linguistic experts to see that you mistranslated something or whatever. I just want to sort of review that because that's important. This would be as close as we'd have to like a full-blown semester project where you use pretty much everything we know, and that was an important thing. Now, if you want to do something like for a larger monitor or a larger device, you're welcome to do that too. Or if it's oriented horizontally, have a different resource file, you're welcome to do that too. So you're welcome to have as many resource qualifiers as you want, but at the very least have one for language. I want you to create an icon. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate, but go through the process. We've seen the icon files. I don't think I've gone through how to create one, but that's easy enough to create.
I think there's files in the Drawbles folder called
Yep.
IC Launcher.
Yep.
You just replace the ones with the one you want.
Those are the ones. Yep. I do want to take input for the last few lectures as well. So we have, after today, we have 4 lectures, although I would like you to sort of present what you've done during one of them. Very low-key, informal sort of presentation. So 3 or 4 lectures left, and getting this project done is sort of job 1 in my book for the remaining part of the semester. So if there's topics that you want to cover or topics that you want to review that we have already reviewed or that we haven't reviewed, if, for example, you want a booster on making an icon, for example, how to do more extensive animations, anything like that, let me know. Because you're welcome to work through this on your own and discover new things, but if I could be of any assistance, let me know as well. And again, don't make your project too broad or too narrow. That, of course, is the art, right? If you look at the projects that we did that I thought were fairly successful, I was really happy the way the blackjack one turned out, and I was really happy the way the memory game turned out. It's hard to make projects to say, make them that size, but in your head, make them that size, because I think that's good for a nice 3-ish week project. All right? And again, I can make suggestions how to either broaden it or scale it back. A game is always good. You know, try to make a simple game with simple rules. Maybe a tic-tac-toe game. Maybe a tic-tac-toe game, because you know, if you go, you should never lose a tic-tac-toe game, by the way, if you play it smart. And the person that goes first can win it if their opponent makes a bad move. So if you write a bot that can play tic-tac-toe and never lose, and win if the person makes a wrong move, then that would be pretty cool. That's just a simple one. But that's what I'm thinking as opposed to, like, say, chess. All right, that would obviously be very difficult. Of course, you could make something more involved by adding bells and whistles to it. You may have a simple game, like craps, for example, but make it neat with animations and bells and whistles and so on. So propose it and go for there. Lab 14 will be sort of your first prototype, where you get a sense that of what it's doing. It may not do everything perfectly. And then finally, Lab 15, the final version. All right. If in terms of due dates, (22nd) for Lab 13. That would be a week from Thursday. That's actually Thanksgiving Day. So feel free not to turn it in Thanksgiving Day and to turn it in the day after or the day before. So I'm not good. I just did that because assignments are typically due Thursdays. The 29th, and finally December 6th. All right. This is actually during finals week. This is the last week of class. This is the next to last week of class that is due. Any question on that? I mentioned that this was probably coming last week. Has anyone given thought to something that they would like to do?
A little bit.
Yeah. Let's just hear what you're planning on doing. I'm just curious and might give other people ideas if they're not sure. Go ahead.
I was thinking of making like a digital version of the board game Harry Potter Hogwarts Battle.
The digital version of what?
Harry Potter Hogwarts Battle. It's a cooperative board deck building game.
Okay.
The full set is really complex, so I just keep it within the first year. So
and what would you do?
Simple. I was thinking of like a way for people to like play the game together. But for now, but since there's only a couple of weeks left in the semester,
right.
So I just keep like single player,
right.
Just the simple rules, just the first year.
Okay. All right, sounds good. I'm not really familiar with that game, so I can't really comment on how difficult it is or simple. Again, it's the end of the semester, right? You probably have finals in other classes if you're taking other classes, so don't put yourself out with anything that is too challenging. What are some things that you might want to go over concerning this that might be useful for you?
Thinking just how to handle the layout really, because there'll be a lot of cards on the board. So
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we can talk about that definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Go ahead.
Interesting that you say Harry Potter game that made a light bulb go off with the Gwent game from the Witcher series. That might be kind of cool. It's like a magic. Are you familiar with Magic the Gathering?
I mean, I know the basic concept, but
I've seen people play it.
Cards have certain levels, and
right.
the higher level wins. This is the basic.
Right.
What I was thinking was some sort of playing field battleground monster avoider or monster chaser, or even like a dungeon crawler type thing, but really simple. With,
Okay.
You can't get touched by a monster, you die. There's
Okay.
treasures, you got to get treasures. Touch
Okay.
the treasures. Everything's moving though randomly, so you have to avoid
Okay.
things. And then maybe a timer on it or something to see how much treasure you can get. Maybe 2 levels.
Okay.
And on that, my big question would be, how would you take an object, even if it's just a square, take your finger, and we're using mouse buttons, but and move that object, click
in a nutshell, that's like gestures.
Gestures.
You know, like handling gestures, like a touch gesture, like a click or a drag or a sling, I think they call it. Okay. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to create a utility to give you access to the various devices on your phone, like GPS,
Okay.
an accelerometer, battery. So you'll be able to see like the attributes and the values in real time.
Cool. All good ideas. You know, it's always tough in a situation like this because, you know, this is, 3 weeks to work on this, so it's not tons of time. So what I'm trying to say is, I plan on rewarding good work. So good work doesn't mean it's perfect, all right? So and what I'm saying is if you kind of have good ambition and you are ambitious in what you are thinking of doing, if you find that you've bit off more than you can chew, don't think that that's going to penalize you. All right, I'm going to try not to say, no, it has to be perfect in order for you to get credit for it. When you consider that 2 out of the 3 assignments you should be able to get done, because the first assignment is just speccing it out. I could spec out anything, right? I could spec out, any kind of assignment, And so that one should be 5 free points. The first rev of it, the first version of it, well, pretty much no matter what the project is, you could come up with something for that, for the first prototype, right? And then finally the last one should be as complete as possible, but, if it's not as complete as you liked it to be, it's not necessarily going to be penalized for that. All right, any questions? Feel free to email me topics as you start to work on this and start to think about it. Feel free to start working on it even before you get the design, because from what I've heard, you folks have good ideas. I'm a little unsure of the scope of some of them, but we can work to scale them down or beef them up if that proves to be a problem. So, don't wait until you turn that in and get it approved for me to go ahead and start working on it, I guess is my statement. All right, I found a much easier example of a SQLite, which is good. All right, made me feel a lot better about it. And you can download it and run it. I'm going to take the time to review the objects that are contained in it. Many of these were contained also in the other example, but there was so much other stuff going on with listers and activities and junk like that it sort of obscured the database piece. So what I like about this is it really just focuses on the database piece of it. So we can pick that piece up. There's a little bit of launching activities, other activities. So instead of fragments, they use activities on this one. So it involves, I think there might be one fragment, but they launch a lot of activities. The one thing about this is they use a list view instead of a recycle view, but you could probably adapt it if you wanted to. It's not that big of a deal. So we're going to look at his description of it, and we're going to look at the code as well. He talks about where the file is, and he actually talks about being able to grab something from the database to actually look at it. There's utilities that allow you to look at it, to verify that it's correct. All right? The first object he talks about is one that we talked about in the lecture with the address book, and that is the SQLite Open Helper. And that primarily, I like the way this guy lays it out because he describes really the main function of it. This is responsible for opening the database, and opening the database is not that huge of a deal except in 2 conditions. One is if you're opening the database and it doesn't exist yet. That's a special case where it's not a run-of-the-mill just open the database. The other is if you have changed versions of the database. So in other words, you have added, you had your version 1 of your application that there was a table with 5 columns. Version 2 comes in and you've added a 6th column to a table, or you add another table, or something along those lines. So the SQL Open Helper helps you with those 2 things. And there is a constructor which opens and provides a database. There is a on create and an on upgrade. And in this case, the database helper, our database helper extends SQLite Open Helper. We have our name of the table. Notice we also are using essentially constants, public, static, final things. Those are, in Java terms, those are constants. Final means they can't change. Public means that because they can't change, they're not sort of subject to the normal rule of keeping your attributes private. All right. Normally in Java, the aim is to keep the attributes private and only access them through the getters and setter methods. All right. Whereas with this is a constant. There may be things that want to know what the table name is. So this is a convenient place to put the table name that we're dealing with. This is a simple database, only has 1 table, but we could certainly do this with multiple tables as well. And it's public, so any class can access this. What does static mean?
Basically, it means you don't have to create the object.
You don't have to create an instance of the object. It's sort of like a class level variable. In other words, you just need the name of the class to refer to that variable.
If it's visible, then you can call it from anywhere, really.
Right. If it's public, you can call it from
anywhere.
anywhere.
Public static. You
Yeah.
can call it from anywhere.
Public static, you can call it from anything, and you don't have to make an instance of this. Again, the example I like to give is if you're doing some sort of astronomy application, you might have a speed of light constant or something like that. Whereas it's a constant, it's not going to change. You don't have to worry about anyone changing that variable, because that's the big problem with making your variables public, is that someone could circumvent your validation and other things just by going directly in and setting some of your attributes on an object. But if you make it final, they can't change it, and so it's okay to make it public. So we have this. We have our table name, we have our column names. ID, subject, description. And then finally we have our database name, and finally we have our database version. We then have a string that actually creates our database. Create table, table name, plus blah, 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 blah. This will create the table name countries, and ID, subject, and description will be columns that are created. And we define the type. The constructor of this simply doesn't really do anything. It calls the super classes constructor and passes it all that and gives it the database version. All right. Keep in mind, remember we talked about this before, if you don't see code in this, it probably exists in the ancestor. So, for example, in the database, in the Open Helper, there is a code to actually open the database. So, like, here we say open the database. Notice we don't have an open method in our, oh, we do have an open method in our database manager. My mistake. We don't have the get writable database in our database helper. Well, that exists somewhere in the ancestors of that SQLite helper, and there's no need for us to overwrite it. Now, we can speculate what that does, get writable database does. We can speculate what this method does. All right? This method probably either that method or the constructor, I would guess one of those two, either the get writable database or the constructor, looks at the version that the database was created as. Well, first of all, looks to see if it exists or not. If it doesn't exist, it creates it, and it runs the onCreate method. All right? So either the constructor or the get writable database method, one of those two, we don't know for sure, we could probably find the documentation somewhere, but somewhere, if that database doesn't exist, it's going to create the database and then call the onCreate method. All right? If it does exist, it's going to look at the version it was created as and look at the current version of the database. And if they're different, it will run the upgrade. All right? They are harsh in this example. This is something I wouldn't necessarily want to do. They drop the table and recreate it. I think you're going to have some very angry users if you do that, all right? Because that would essentially delete everything and force the user to start to add over. But they wanted to put some code here. I would think more like an alter to add a column to a database might be a more typical thing to do. Then you might go and update the database to populate that column, for example. All right? Trying to think of an example. If we were to add here, let's say the nation's capital, all right, there might be a routine that would open it up and create that column, and I guess it could do updates, but that might be tricky to do. It might instead just create the column, leave it null, and then the user could supply the nation's capital if they wanted to, in this case. But that's the job of the Open Helper. It's going to be used to open and get a writable copy of the database. And the only curveballs there is the database doesn't exist, so it has to be created, in which case the onCreate event will get called, or the database is a different version than the version that the application expects, in which case it calls the upgrade method. Okay? So that's this object. If you were going to do this, you would have your stuff in here instead of their stuff. You know, if you want to create a table, you would give a table name, or if you want to create two tables, you'd have your table names, you'd have your column names, you'd have your database name, you'd have your database version, you'd put in your the create statements for the tables that you want to create, and you'd call the create table script, and you would call the onUpgrade script and have some code in there that would go if there was an upgrade. So that is the first of our classes that we talk about here. Now, we have a class that this guy calls his database manager that is a subclass of, oh no, I'm sorry. We have our database manager, which, let's see what it is a subclass of. That's not a subclass of anything. All right? This was a subclass of the OpenHelper. Our database manager, though, refers to a database helper, has a context, has the SQL database, has a context that it uses in the constructor, has an open method, has a close method, has an insert method, a fetch method, a update method, and a delete method. So it handles it's a sort of an unfortunate acronym. It handles the CRUD operations, C-R-U-D, create, retrieve, update, and delete. I don't know, what would be a better arrangement of those letters? I don't know. Curd, if you're a cheese fan? All right. At any rate, so that's what it does. We can open the database and we can close it. All right. It's great, and it's good program architecture to separate functionality into different things. For example, there is a model view controller model, all right, where you have the model represents the sort of persistent data and so on. You have the view, which represents what the user is seeing, and then you have controllers that sort of manipulate that and interact with that. This database manager abstracts or takes out and encapsulate all the things you'd want to do with the database. Because what do you want to do to a database? You want to open it, you want to close it, you want to write to it, you want to delete from it, you want to update it, and finally you want to retrieve stuff. So let's look at the three things. Let's look at everything but the fetch. All right, so let's look for the insert, update, and delete. We'll save the fetch until last. The fetch takes the name of the country and the description. Let me run this just so that you know what it looks like. I should have done that earlier. If we run this application, you get I entered this in already, but it's essentially a list of countries. If they're all gone, you get a little message saying no records found, which is a lot better than that other example where you just got a blank screen staring at you. Anyhow, we can click the plus here, and we can enter in a country and a currency. So we can enter in United States and dollar. And we click add record. There it's on the list. All right. And we can edit it. US dollar, maybe. And update it, or we already saw it delete. And this supports multiple ones. Let's see. Japan, yen, and there you go. Okay. So the insert takes a country name and the description, which the country name, of course, is a name. The description is the currency type. I gotta say, I love this example, but I have a feeling the person that wrote this took another example and tweaked it because his column names are goofy. Subject, and description instead of country and currency. But what the heck, I'll forgive him, all right, because he came up with a good thing. Content value. Content value is similar to anyone that has done ASP.NET development, and I forget who has. This is similar to like an ASP.NET parameter object. Effectively what you have is you have a name of a parameter and a value. And this is nice for a number of reasons. It does a lot of formatting for you, and so on, if you do that. things that you want to include in your SQL statement. And that'll be useful for a insert, and that'll be useful for an update. You really don't need it for a delete, and you really don't need it for a query. So for an insert, you have these parameters. This column I want to set to this. You have the same thing for an update statement, right? The nice thing about this is the classes allow you to do database interaction without really understanding SQL statements. All right? Because you create these two parameters, you then call on your database helper the insert function. All right? I use the table name. That's the insert. That's the table that I am. That's the table that I am inserting into. And then I have the content value. So I have my list of parameters. So I don't really have to know how to write a SQL statement. I know that if I call the insert method and I supply the table name, a null, not really sure what that does, but the content value is that content value, which is an ordered pair of the name of a column and a value. And that accomplishes an insert. The update does pretty much the same thing. The difference with this, all right, is that if you notice an update gets past an ID where an insert does not get past an ID. The ID, the key to this table, is an auto increment field, an auto number field, which means that incrementally the first row gets number 1, the second row gets number 2 and 3, and so on down the line. So you don't need that when you're inserting, because the database will generate the key for that. But you do need it when you're doing an update. So you need to pass the ID in along with the name and description. We're going to create, again, the content values to say we want the name of the country to be this, we want the currency to be this. And the only difference, other than calling the update function, is we're going to pass in a where clause. All right? And the where clause is going to be where the ID column equals the ID that we are updating. Are all of you at least somewhat familiar with SQL statements? Okay. So, yeah, what we're doing now is we're forming the where clause. We want to update the row that we're looking at, so how else do you do it? Well, you give it the ID number, and that's what that does. The delete is even simpler still. All right? Because we have our delete from table, and our where clause is also going to be the ID. All right? So we're deleting where the ID equals that. So those functions handle the dirty work. We're calling functions. This database manager is calling functions on the OpenHelper. I'm sorry, not the OpenHelper, but the actual database, the actual SQLite database, is calling functions on that to do open or insert, update, and delete. Questions about any of those?
Yeah, kind of. I appreciate it's a really good example. It's nice and simple, but are they kind of like missing like a lot of error checking too? Because if you do an update, you don't pass a valid ID. Is there going to be like an exception?
Let's see. There was
There's no checker to see if the database helper sent no if you're trying to close it.
I did see. Where did I see an exception?
There was one for open.
Yeah, I saw exception in the list activity or somewhere.
this just simply kept it simple, right?
Yeah, I'm guessing they did that as well. Some of these things probably should be wrapped in try-catch blocks and all that. Like an obvious one would be, well, let's see what could go wrong. On an insert or an update, if you had like required, if you set the database columns to required, if you didn't supply a field for it, it would insert it. It would try to insert an empty column value, and that could be an error, right? A delete you could have if you had more tables. You could have a foreign key constraint if you tried to delete the parent of other rows in a related table, and so those things could go wrong. We can't have that because we only have one table, so we can delete things. Shouldn't cause a problem. Even if we gave it an invalid ID, that doesn't really give us an error. All right, so at the worst case scenario is it wouldn't delete the right thing. It wouldn't delete anything. An update could blow up and an insert could blow up. Let's see what the database says for what we created.
It might be the way that the GUI handles stuff, it might be hard to actually.
Yeah.
So that might be how they address it.
Text not null. Okay, so you have to have a country, I'm thinking, but you don't have to have a currency. So if we go and run this, and we don't supply a currency, or we don't supply a country rather, I'll bet you there's validation in the GUI that handles that. Which I'm with you. I would have exception catching there, because what if your GUI was wrong?
Well, yeah, if you,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
I know we're nitpicking in a simple example,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So I just kind of trying to.
It's best practice to
Yeah.
catch your errors.
So I could put in, let's say, Russia, and well, let's see. If I don't put anything in,
And blank.
it ends up allowing me to do it. So, yeah, they just didn't
I think it just parses it as an empty string.
pay too attention. Yeah, it could be an empty string rather than a null. And what is the Russia currency? Is it ruble? Yeah. That's what they always say in movies. I don't know if that was like the Soviet era one or, All right, anyhow. But yeah, that's a point well taken. That would be a substantial improvement to put. Even if there was validation in the GUI. I'm definitely a believer of you don't rely on the GUI, you rely on the database for integrity things, integrity issues.
So just be really anal about validation when you're taking around the database.
Yeah, and just in general, anytime you go to you try to communicate with some outside entity, like writing to a database or contacting another server, something could go wrong. So have exception handling or whatever. Okay, let's look at the fetch. Because the fetch returns a cursor. What is a cursor? Don't mean the blinking thing on a screen. All right, it's sort of an unfortunate name for it. What is a cursor in this context?
I think I've seen these in similar concepts in other databases. You return an object and you query it, so you get a value, then it increments to the next value.
Essentially, you think of a cursor as like being like a list of things. And depending on the type of cursor, some lists you can only process going forward, some you can forward and backward or whatever. But essentially, it's a result of a query. If you think of the result of a query, what is the result of a query going to look like? It's going to look like this. If I do, let's say my database, I do select ID, country, I'm using the right column names, by the way, I forget what their goofy ones are. Currency from countries. Mine is going to look like, the result's going to look like essentially a table. if I have joined two tables together, my results is going to look like a table. And the table is what? As rows and columns. So it's going to have the ID of the first one. So 2 might be the US, and dollar 3 might be Japan, and yen 4 might be Russia, and ruble. Again, the one thing that they did here, a little sloppy, again, we're nitpicky, is they didn't put an order by clause in here. So it's coming back in probably the primary key order, but essentially an order that are semi-unpredictable. We probably would want to select that maybe and sort it by key, sort it by currency type, sort it by country or something like that. And we'll look at how to do that in a minute. All right? But this is an object that sort of has a representation of this as a cursor. Now with a cursor, we can get the next row and then get the columns for it. So we essentially read through this back like in the old days when we had sequential files, or even better, when we read off of cards, all right? Where you would get the next card, get the next record, and process it, get the columns off of it. So we can read, we're always with the cursor reading the next thing, or with the kind of cursors we're using. So we get a cursor, and there's like a pointer that points where we're at in this. And typically we ask for the next thing. And we'll get a true if there is a next thing. All right? We'll get a false if there isn't. So we start off pointing at this. We can grab these fields and display them on the screen. We can do a read next, get these. Oh, we're at the end. All right? So that essentially is what a cursor is. We can scroll through it. Not scroll through it like in a visual way, but our code can iterate through it, is probably a better way to say it. This is a cursor. That's what we're going to do with this. We get our list of columns, which is, again, remember it's that public static in our database helper. It's column 1, column 2, column 3, and so on. We do a database query. And our query includes the table name, the list of columns, which is an array, the selection, that is if we would have a where clause. All right? So maybe we would only want items of a certain category instead of like maybe we would have a region associated with the country, and maybe this particular query would give me back every country in North America or every country in Asia or Europe or whatever. We then have a group by clause, a having clause that's used to do aggregate functions on things, and then finally an order by clause. So the order by clause would be used if we want to, which we should probably use to do this. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to say, I want this ordered by the country, all right, to just improve it. Notice again, it's pretty easy to see that this is really a select statement. So, what does a select statement look like? Select columns, that's this array, from table where something equals something, maybe a group by or whatever, or maybe an order by. All right? So what they've done is they've just created a function that sort of constructs a select statement from these different parameters. And that lives in the database class, which we have a database pointed to. We used our OpenHelper to get our database. And we then do that query, and if our cursor is not equal to null, we move to the first item, and then we return the cursor. So we're going to return either a cursor that has stuff in it or doesn't have stuff in it. All right? Now let's run this and make sure that my order by business worked. Yeah, Japan, Russia, United States. So they now are sorted in the correct order. It's kind of nice that you really don't have to write the SQL statement. By just creating the parameters and creating the arrays and all that, it does that for you. So that's these two classes. These two classes are the ones that do the database. The next things we have to look at are the add country activity, the country list, and the modify country activity. Let's look first at the add country activity. I know I'm going a little bit backwards, right? Because the first activity that comes up, the main activity, is the country list activity. So I'm going to look at that for a second. I don't know if I can do this one justice in the amount of time that I have. I will say, if we selected to add a record, it starts a new activity. All right, to add a new record. So that's what, there's a menu for it. It inflates the menu. That's this guy over here. The menu to add a record. The icon for it's a little plus sign. So if we click that, make sure that we've selected that for sure, even though that's the only option. And make sure that that's the item that we clicked on, because this this method gets past an item, which is the item that got clicked on. We verify that it's the add record. If it is, we start a new activity. The new activity then goes in, sets the content view to the activity to add a listener, grabs pointers to the different stuff, sets the on-click listener, on-click, we go in and we grab the values from it, and we call our database manager's insert record. And then we create an activity, or we create another intent to go back to the original activity, which I'm not sure that's the best way to do that. That seems to be starting another activity.
Don't you normally just hit the back arrow?
Yeah, you hit the back arrow to do that, yeah. So I think there's a better way to do that. Maybe next time we'll look at that in more detail. The update works just about the same, because if we click on for this, let's talk about the list first. We'll talk about the list, and then we'll talk about the update. And we'll do that next time, because we're just about out of time here. All right? So bring your questions and things we could talk about. Spend some time doing a little bit of design and stuff, and we will talk about the activity. And then we can maybe play around with doing some error catching and other stuff in this example to maybe beef it up a little bit. It is available online in Canvas, so the page that I pointed at and the code, you have to tweak a little bit of it. Again, it's a good example, minus the error trapping and minus the bit that they use a list view instead of a recycle view. All right, we'll see you. Is anyone going to lab? Okay, we'll see you over there.